In this video, I want to talk about fishing a jig. A jig is by far one of my favorite lures of all time. As a matter of fact, this is the bait that I would choose to fish if I could only have one bait for the rest of my life. Now, specifically in today's video, I really want to talk about the trailers that you use on a jig, because there is a number of different soft plastics that we can use on a jig, but there's really a few select ones that I like to use, and I'm also going to talk about kind of the reasons when I pick each one of those. Now, before we get into the video, this one's brought to you by my apparel company, and specifically by my new product, the duck shorts. The duck shorts are a highly durable, stretchy, lightweight pair of material. They are also water resistant. There's been a number of people that have finally got their hands on this thing, and everyone has really great reviews of it. I think it's the best pair of shorts that there is out there on the market. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased, but anyways, I know that it's not short season for a lot of you, but it is the holiday season. So I'm gonna leave some links down below. They are on sale right now, and if you guys wanna check them out, feel free to do so. All right, let's talk about jig trailers, because let's be honest, you can put anything you want on the back of a jig. Anything that you want on the back of a jig. And I do think that it's important to put something on the back of a jig, unless you're kind of going like Josh Jones style, throwing this out and using your forward-facing sonar to target, suspended bass. But we're not going to talk about that today. That's a totally different video for a different day. But what I do want to talk about is trailers. Now, with all that being said about you can put everything on the back of a jig, there are a few things that I choose more than most of the time. That doesn't really make sense, but you know where I'm going with it. The first one is going to be a crawl style trailer like what we have right here. This is a Strike King crawl, a Rage crawl, and I have used this a lot for trailers in the past. Now, using a crawl style trailer like this, when the jig is falling down or when you're swimming it through the water column, these two legs flap back and forth. Now, it's not just the Strike King crawl that does this. I mean, Berkley has their Chigger crawl. Another one that I like and use a lot is this little X-Zone Muscleback Finesse crawl. Same type of thing. They all have this kind of commotion to them. So when do I like to use that type of crawl? It's usually when I'm fishing around bass that are aggressive or in warmer water. That is really a big thing here, because in warm water or around aggressive bass, they tend to like an aggressive motion. And so a lot of times in the summer, that is the bait that I pick up. Now, if I am fishing in really highly pressured situations, I have found that a chunk style trailer tends to outperform the crawl style trailer. If there's anything that we know about bass, it's that when you have really high pressured situations, typically the less motion that your bait has, the less sound that it puts out, the less vibration that it has, the more bites that you're going to get. In a trailer like this, which is the Zoom Super Chunk Junior, has very little action at all. It literally is more just there to be able for the bass to see. Like, these don't flip and flap all over the place. They just kind of go wherever the jig goes. It doesn't really do a whole lot, but that no action can be very enticing to a bass. Like if this is the same reason that baits like a Senko works so well, because they have very little action. The same reason that a Ned rig works really well. Those baits have zero action to them, but yet they're some of the most fish catching machines in the world. And so when I'm dealing with high pressure situations, I love the chunk style trailer. Also, if I am fishing in really cold water, it's here, it's November, pretty much from November, December, January, getting into February, if I'm fishing a jig, I have a chunk trailer on there, again, because we're fishing in cold water where everything's metabolism has slowed down. So you're not gonna have a lot of bait fish and crawdads. Actually, there's a lot of crawdads that burrow in the winter, but either way, they don't have a lot of action. And so you don't want to be overly aggressive in cold water and pick up a crawl style bait that has a lot of flap to it. Now, when I say cold water, I think it's very important to define this a little bit, because Some of y'all, depending on where you live, if you live in the southern part of the United States, you know, your cold water might be 55 degrees. That might be cold for you. And so in that water temp, I guess for me, that's not what I define as cold. So in that water temp, you might be fine using the crawl style trailer. For me, it's really anything that's like below 50 degrees, because I fish a lot when the water is like upper 30s to 50s. And that is when like that chunk style trailer makes a huge difference to me with really having no action. Now there's a couple of other jig style trailers that I will use. And I forgot to mention this, so I should say it real quick, but going back to the flappy crawl style trailers, really there's a couple of different ones that I will pick depending on the size of the bait that I want. For example, I don't have one with me, but a Zoom speed crawl, which is a very small bait. It has just very little crawl action to it. I tend to use that in the summer a lot, but when I want a very compact jig. So if I'm using a very small jig, a very compact jig, I will use that. If I want a bigger bulky jig, like a mop style jig, I will make that I will use the same crawl style trailer, but I'll just use a bigger one. You know, the Chigger Crawl has a 5-inch version. There's bigger style crawls you can put on the back of a big jig. So every type of crawl style trailer out there can be used. I just select different ones for how compact or how big I want that jig to be in the water. Now, we've talked mostly about crawl style baits and chunk style baits, which really, to me, represent, you know, your bottom baits. If I'm working a jig across the bottom or vertically, those are the baits that I use the most. Now, when I say vertically, I don't want you to think that I vertical jig a jig. What I mean by vertically is like pitching and flipping it into cover, where you're working that bait up and down. And so that's what I mean by vertically. Now, if I am swimming a jig, probably still the number one trailer that I go with is that crawl, that, you know, rage crawl. But I also will fish kind of a boot tail style swim bait on the back of a jig as well. If I'm fishing, I tend to do this a little bit more around grass, just because I think that boot tail comes through that grass a little bit better. Now, I'm not always sure that a crawl versus a boot tail swim bait on the back of a swim jig is going to get more bites than the other, but it does impact the action of that jig, because a boot tail doesn't tend to have as much drag as a crawl. So if you want that bait really high in the water column, sometimes it's better to go with the crawl because there's more drag on that bait. It's going to create more lift and bring that jig closer to the surface. Where if you have a single, you know, boot tail swim bait on the back, that bait tends to want to ride a little bit lower. So you might have a 3/8 ounce swim jig. If you put a crawl on it, it's going to ride higher in the water column. If you put a swim bait on it, it's going to ride a little bit lower in the water column. So sometimes you can add a trailer to the back of the jig that just simply helps you to keep it in the water column that you want to keep it in. You know, and this just depends on what type of swim jig fishing you are doing. You might be going down the bank, targeting, you know, visible cover that you can see with your eyes, docks and even rock, grass, logs, whatever it may be. You want to keep that bait really high. Or maybe you're fishing a swim jig on more like offshore hydrilla. You know, I fished a swim jig on Gunnersville before, and on Lake Kissimmee before, where I wanted to get that swim jig down in 7 and 8 foot of water around some grass. Using the swim bait in that situation helps me to get that bait a little bit deeper without having to just simply use a heavier style swim jig. So when it comes to the back of a trailer, the trailers that you use on the back of a jig, you can really use a little bit of everything. Now, there is one thing that I wanted to talk quickly about. It's not something that I do a lot, but I have seen a couple of situations out there where threading on a worm on the back of a jig can actually be just something that the bass have not seen. So, and what I mean by worm is like a 7-inch curly tail worm, or a 7-inch Magnum trick worm, for example. You know, a bigger, thicker, longer plastic. I think that there are days out there where the bass will eat that when they won't eat kind of your regular jigs, just because they don't know what the crap it is. And they're just like, you know, what is that? And they see this big tail going along the bottom. And I think that there are a lot of times in bass fishing where throwing something that is vastly just different in comparison to what everyone else is throwing is going to help you to get more bites. Now, again, my favorite word, with that all being said, I do like to keep things simple, and that's why I use primarily the crawl style trailer. And where's my chunks? And the chunks. Now, one last thing I want to leave you with is that I think that a jig goes perfectly with some sort of scent. And what I mean by that is, like, I will use a lot of different scents when I'm fishing a jig because, you know, on your typical jig, you have all this silicone material and you have your big jig trailer. So I just feel like it kind of helps hold in a lot of that scent. And I did a full video all about scent over on BassFishingHQ, where I actually looked at a study that was done, and you can really kind of see just how powerful this sense of smell is for a bass. And I think it will really change your guys' mind on when to use scent. I'm gonna leave that linked right up here. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video all about jig trailers. Don't forget to check out that fin gear, and I will see you guys tomorrow.